Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Chatham House on this December Tuesday evening. My name is Matthew Oxenford. I'm a research associate here in our Global Economy and Finance Department, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Louise Shelley, who will be presenting her very interesting and rather thorough book examining the state of the illicit economy, Dark Commerce, How a New Illicit Economy is Threatening Our Future. Having read through this book, I can say that this covers an amazing range of somewhat depressing topics, including the illegal wildlife trade, cybercrime, human trafficking, drugs, counterfeits, pollution, financial crime, any number of diverse illicit activities that are unfortunately all too common in this new world. Going through the book, I was struck by two major themes: how this rise in illicit crime has proceeded apace with the rise in illicit and legal trade throughout the world and has created new challenges, and also how that while these sectors are very diverse, there's a significant amount of commonality in how to treat with them around the world. I don't want to steal too much from Louise, but by way of brief introduction, Louise Shelley is a professor in the School of Public Policy at George Mason University and the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, which she founded in 1998, and has been looking at these issues since at least 1995, where she ran when she ran programs on these issues in the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia, and can bring a wealth of experience on these issues. In terms of a few minor housekeeping notes, this event is open and on the record, and we encourage anyone who would like to tweet at #CHEvents. Otherwise, we'd also like to encourage you to keep your phones on silent so that you don't disturb the rest of the proceedings. If you find this presentation interesting, there are several copies of Dr. Shelley's book available for purchase after the event. So hopefully you'll have a chance to dig even deeper into some of these issues. But without further ado, I'd like Dr. Shelley to take the stage and provide a bit of an overview.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to your responses. I'm afraid that I'm not going to bring you a lot of Christmas cheer with this book, but I hope it's a wake-up call for things that we all need to address more in the new year. So, dark commerce, as introduced, is a very broad theme, and one of the ways that I've tried to bring the transformation of this phenomenon into perspective is to do a dive back into history. So here we have, and I'm not planning to give you a straight lecture, but bring you some images, because it's hard for you who are not used to thinking about this topic to imagine it. So here we have Hammurabi's Code, the first legal document in the world that has been found, and one of the provisions in it is against fencing of stolen property. So already in antiquity, people were dealing in tangible goods, illicitly obtained, and they knew where to take their stolen goods. And that was a very, very serious offense. But it didn't operate on such a large scale. If you go back a few centuries in London and think about Beggar's Opera, we're thinking about a period in Mall Flanders in which there were large numbers of fences and large numbers of pickpockets, and there was a large amount of property to be fenced. But even in that very colorful period of London history, we did not get to the level of fencing that is known until we got to the cyber world. So what is this a picture of? This is a website for teeth whitener. And you'll say, what the hell are we talking about of teeth whitener in a world in the cyber world? One of the most interesting and large-scale cases of e-fencing, that is the fencing of stolen goods online, is the case on the Pacific Northwest of the US and Canada, in which a pair of Russian illicit entrepreneurs was organizing the theft of teeth whitener from numerous stores on a large scale, and in a short period of time, in a couple years, they had made millions in this business of fencing whitener as it was being sold to Eastern European markets and Russian markets, and were buying expensive cars and Vancouver real estate. So this is what never could be imagined in a world before illicit trade went online. So 4,000 years, we had illicit trade based on personal relationships that the fence would have to pay in goods, in coinage, and now in the cyber world, we have much of this being done through cyber payments, through Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And in the latest stage of this cyber world, we have products, as we will see, that don't even exist in the tangible world. So this is our new cyber world that's brought illicit trade into what I'm saying, operating on steroids. I enjoy talking to an audience in London because as Britain has had such an important role in international trade, many of my historical references apply to British society or English society. And on an earlier trip to the Victoria and Albert Museum, I was looking at an exhibition of the history of textiles, and here you have a discussion of chintz and how it was being smuggled on a mass scale into Britain. And that's the captions from the V&A. And here's the type of material that was being smuggled. Textiles before the present period of technology and other goods were the most valuable commodities and therefore smuggled. But if you were a smuggler in Britain, a society based on trade, the penalties for being engaged in smuggling were not that serious. Here is Mr. Mandrin, a Frenchman, who was smuggling tobacco and textiles, and here he is depicted in prison before he was executed. And if you think about what is going on in the Philippines today, and of drug traffickers being assassinated in significant numbers, this is nothing compared to what was going on in France before the French Revolution in regards to textile smugglers. They were tortured, they were executed, and because of their opposition to state power, they became the subject of songs that survive in French popular culture until today. So this idea of narco-corridos, of songs that extol illicit traffickers like we see in Mexico today, have their precedence in the historical past. So what is different today is that textiles are not the most valuable form of illicit commodities. We now have drugs that didn't exist as an illicit activity prior to the 1800s. We now have human trafficking, which is a crime because the slave trade was legal and often state-sanctioned. We have the rise in the end of the 19th century of theft of intellectual property. And in the latest stages of illicit trade, we have trade in natural resources, and now in such things as intangible goods, such as botnets and malware. So when we think about illicit trade, people will say, oh, those smugglers, they're greedy, or they're trying to evade taxes. But it's a much, much more complex picture than that. Illicit trade has served the interests of states for many periods. Just as Sir Francis Drake was a pirate to some, he became Sir Francis Drake because he served the English crown. And this system of where pirates could make money for themselves, but also money for the state, exists today. We have cyber pirates who personally profit, but may also serve the Russian and the Chinese governments. So this system of duality and the dual uses of illicit trade is not a new phenomenon. And we now have illicit trade funding non-state actors, criminals, terrorists, insurgents, apart from states. So this transformation of illicit trade is more than in just fenced goods. It is large now, it is anonymized, and it no longer is involved in currencies backed by states. And as I say, it is threatening our futures because some counterfeit goods include products that can actually kill you. I'll show you a picture of an online pharmacy. Products can steal your identity and your savings. And what is especially problematic today is that in our resource-scarce planet, we have a targeting of the Earth's natural resources. Just as we had in the past of organized crime going after time-sensitive industries like ports. Organized crime was active in the port of Marseille or New York because if you don't unload a boat and your bananas rot or your fish rots, you lose your cargo. We are now in a time-sensitive planet, and we are having illicit traders targeting what we need for our survival. Moreover, as we find ways to try and save the planet, like setting up carbon markets, a diverse array of criminals are the first ones to target it. And the hijacking of the European carbon markets cost the EU about $5 billion. And the products of the illicit markets online can also kill you. The online pharmaceuticals, the absence of quality controls, of counterfeits. This is an example of people complaining on Amazon that the products are counterfeit. Sometimes they can lead to fires. In the Middle East, there are large numbers of fatalities in auto accidents through fake auto parts. And we have the major problem of fentanyl being sold online. Fentanyl is sold online in websites from China that are open, that is, they're on the web because they're only selling to foreign customers. But if you're a criminal like Dread Pirate Roberts, who started the Silk Road, he was operating in the dark net because in the US and the West, law enforcement is looking for sellers of narcotics, and therefore he had to operate in a safer space than the open web. So here is an example of the kind of illicit commodities that you can find in the dark web, a way that you enter the sort of the inner space of the internet, in which you need a special software such as Tor to enter it. And that is where the most pernicious products are sold. Child pornography, WMD, drugs, and this is where you also find intangible products such as ransomware that can tie up your computer and force you to pay money to get access to your data or steal your software. That's what's going on in the dark web. So there's a business decision being made by criminals in the cyber world of whether they are going to reach more customers by going through the open web or whether they have to be more cautious and go through the dark web. And that's one of the things I talk about, is how this illicit business operates. But what is particularly pernicious, and that's one of the reasons that I talk about this illicit commerce threatening our future, is that we have environmental crime that is growing at the fastest rate of all kinds of transnational crime, 5% to 7% growth annually. And as I say, it is not just criminals that are involved with it. as I say, there are not that many criminals in the world to do this much harm to our planet. So what you're having in this are government officials, bankers, facilitators, many different types of people who are involved in illicit trade in water, corporations that are engaged in excessive fishing, kleptocrats who are running parts of countries that are rich in trees that are cutting them down. And I'll give you some illustrations. And targeting wildlife, which is an illustration of what I call dysfunctional selection, where under Darwin you have natural selection, where the healthiest, the best animals survive. And today it is the elephant with the longest tusks or the rhino with the best horns, and they're the ones that are killed. And it's dysfunctional selection, not only for the animals, but for the people who are engaged in this poaching, because they receive a significant amount of money that they don't know how to use, and they dissipate the money rapidly just as they kill off the animals and cause them to extinction. So the two of them often live short lives, the animals and the humans that kill them. So what is of concern is not only the problems that come from the elimination of species, but the domino effects. For example, we have a serious problem, if you think of what went on in Somalia and the piracy, was that one branch of Italian organized crime didn't carefully dispose of their toxic waste, but instead took it off to their former colony off of Somalia and dumped waste there that killed the fish that helped lead to the Somalian piracy. That's what I call a domino effect. Another example is that in Syria, there was a terrible drought over a decade ago, and yet the ruling elite under Assad's father was engaged in illicitly selling water rights, so people dug wells. The water was totally gone, and in a short period of time, one of the largest rural to urban migrations occurred in Syria of millions of people who went into urban areas that were totally unequipped for them. And this is where the Arab Spring started. And from that came the mass migrations and the conflict that we know from this region. So this is another example of the domino effect. And many of these problems of deforestation, fraud in the EU carbon markets are linked to large-scale financial flows. So here's an example of pictures of water mafias that are engaged in illicit water trade in India, in Pakistan, in Central America, where there's not enough water, and it becomes a commodity of illicit trade. And why the term mafia is used, it's also, there's an element of coercion in these markets. Here's pictures of illegal deforestation. One of the cases that I talk about is a leader of Sarawak who deforested 80% of the territory that he was on with funding and financing for building roads to remove the trees from major Western banks. And where did the money wind up from this illicit trade? Some of it wound up, according to a GAO report in the United States, in the Lincoln Building in Seattle. And who rents the Lincoln Building in Seattle, which is a large building? It is the regional headquarters of the FBI that is supposed to investigate corruption. And so this report was done by the GAO to show the problems of absence of due diligence and how they're not thinking broadly enough when they're renting properties for the US government. And there have been many environmental protesters outside of the FBI headquarters in Seattle. So this goes on in Southeast Asia, and the profits wind up in the United States, and the rent is being paid by the US government. In illegal fishing, which is a massive global phenomenon, in the US alone, 1/4 to 1/3 of what is called wild-caught seafood is illegally caught. And it occurs in waters such as off the coast of West Africa, where the individuals are deprived of not only their major protein source, but their livelihood, which has also helped promoting the migration north and the attempts to reach Europe. But what is also doubly tragic about it is that when you're running an illicit fishing vessel, you often use illicitly obtained workforce, such as the men who are sold to the sea, because if your fishing boat is hauled off, as has been the case in South Africa, then you just abandon the crew because they are not legally registered people and you're running an illicit operation. So one of the things that we're seeing in this illicit world is that different types of illicit trade go together, and we can't stovepipe them. Illegal fishing goes with human trafficking. And there's another case of this. As you see, we have a dead rhino here, and we have a picture of a young Vietnamese woman right here beside the rhino. And you'll say, what is this about? Is that many of the rhinos are going to, rhino horn is going to Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam. And the young women were trafficked women who were posing as hunters so that you could legally kill rhino. And so there you had a coupling of human trafficking with slaughter of precious and declining numbers of rhinos. So this is sort of the problem in a nutshell. What can be done about this? One of the things that's important, and part of the reason I wrote the book, is for people to understand what a serious problem dark commerce is today. It not only worsens the problem of global warming, as we've had massive deforestation, we've had the problems of hijacking of carbon markets, but it's also a problem in its own right in prolonging conflicts, of leading to large-scale human displacement. One of the things that we need to understand is that these solutions to this problem are not based totally on governments. After all, the people who are involved in this trade, some of them are government officials, not just crime groups, but a lot of this activity is being carried out in the cyber world, which is controlled not by states, but by private organizations. And much of the messaging that allows the illicit trade in rhinos and other commodities to be carried out is carried out through social media. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to be having much closer relationships with the tech world, with the corporate world, and public-private partnerships that can help address these problems, because the activity is not going on in state-controlled territory, but is going on in a cyber world that is controlled by private corporations and not by governments. There's no grand strategy to address this problem. And sometimes what you might think about as the response is not necessarily the most obvious response. You might think, well, what do you do to get rid of these fishing boats that are engaged in illicit fishing? Some of them, there are tech solutions where large tech companies are helping detect the fishing and provide warnings and oversight. There are military measures, but sometimes an answer may be helping the Chinese that are seeking so much fish to develop their own fishing industries and farm fishing within their own country to help provide a protein source. So it's not just that you need a repressive measure. Sometimes you need an economic innovation that can help deal with this. One of the problems I talk about is the very significant problem of illegal pesticides that are now 1/3 of the pesticide market in India. They're also present in China, and according to Europol, they represent 10% of European markets, and in Northeastern Europe, 1/4 of it. So what do you need, and what is being done in India is to have buying cooperatives where savvy and knowledgeable Indians can help buy for their community members and pool their money so that they're not necessarily buying the cheapest commodities, where people can read and know who their suppliers are and help guarantee good products for their community. Therefore, we need to think in new and creative ways of how to address this problem. We need to increase public awareness of it, the risks, the costs, the vulnerabilities, and there's a very important role for journalists of educating people on these problems. And first of all, just as I've tried to get you to think about how these problems are all linked, there isn't just a problem of drug trade or human trafficking. These problems are going together in the most unusual combinations you can imagine. We need to think about how to work on holistic solutions to focus on illicit trade generally, focusing on greater transparency, opening up free trade zones that have been major vehicles through which illicit wildlife, illicit timber, even WMD transit. And we need to think about how we introduce policies that are not going to lead to an opening for criminals and corrupt officials and opportunists like the carbon markets that turned out to be a feeding frenzy for a very wide range of criminal actors, including members of Deutsche Bank, at least one of whom went to prison for their involvement in this illicit activity. So it involves financiers as well who need to be made more responsible. And we need to focus much more on the transparency of financial markets, including beneficial ownership, and focusing on the supply chains and what people are transporting to market, which includes transporters and brokers and all of the people involved. So we also need to think about the important role that corruption plays in all of this. And corruption needs to be front and center in our strategies to combat illicit trade. One of the problems that we have is that there is such differences in policies even within the European Union. For example, in regards to human trafficking, which I write about in this book, you have the legalization of prostitution and of owning and running brothels in the Netherlands, and in Sweden, it is totally illegal to buy sexual services. So these are totally unharmonized policies. And it's hard to harmonize policies when people have totally different approaches to social problems. But it is this difference in policies that are exploited by criminals. It's differences in tax policies in regards to cigarettes that make them commodities that are highly smuggled. One of the things that we need to do, and I think is key, is that we need to make online platforms and social media much more responsible for what they're selling and they're facilitating. Recently, the US Congress, by a 97 vote, passed a law to make online platforms be responsible to combat human trafficking. And that's about the only area of legislation in which our Congress can agree. But since most of these online firms that are so involved in facilitating illicit trade globally are operating out of the United States, it's very important that they be more responsible, not only for not facilitating hate speech and fake news, but also their role in facilitating illicit trade must become much stronger, and the response to it must demand that they spend the time and the resources to examine their platforms and weed out the illicit, and not just have comments on websites that this is a counterfeit product that might harm you. That's not sufficient. And we need a whole of society approach to this problem that requires civil society, journalists, the financial community, multilateral organizations to work together. And we need to work on communities to make them more resilient as they face increasing stress and don't begin to participate in the illicit economy because there are no legitimate alternatives. So we're dealing with a very large, complex, and diverse problem. But if we don't begin to address it in a serious way, we're going to have many more consequences that we do not want to face in our global community of displaced people, forced migrations, and of enduring conflicts facilitated by the products of illicit trade. Thank you.
I think that was a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion of illicit trade and what we can do about it. I'm going to open the floor to questions in a minute, so everyone think of what you'd like to ask. But I'd like to just ask one question on, as taking the chair's prerogative. You talk about the role of the state and how some countries are more willing to turn a blind eye or even sponsor illicit activity. And it seems like a lot of the issues that you've addressed are either states that are either unwilling or don't have the capacity to intervene on the behalf of tackling illicit commerce. Are there examples of states that have gone from a position where they aren't taking this problem seriously or can't take this problem seriously to an example in which they've been quite successful? I know you mentioned Singapore in the book, and if there are any particular success stories to be a bit more hopeful in how we might be able to move to a higher cooperation environment.
I think that there are examples. Just as I mentioned, Singapore, Hong Kong had a history of high levels of corruption. South Korea, there are many Asian countries that have made progress. For example, if you look at the illicit wildlife trade, it used to be also very prominent in Japan and South Korea, but as they have become more democratic and more committed to the rule of law, they're not part of the problem anymore. So it's not as if every part of illicit trade has been eliminated, but there has been a transformation where there is an attention to the need for us to be part of a larger community and responsible for the resources of our society.
And then just related to that, you mentioned rule of law there, and when you were talking about Duterte as a modern day example of low equilibrium tolerance for illicit activities, do you think that there is a link between strong rule of law and crackdown on illicit trade, or do you think it's possible to have one without the other?
I haven't seen many examples where you have authoritarian societies and a lot of respect for, well, I should say, very corrupt societies. I've seen authoritarian societies that have cracked down on illicit trade, but I haven't seen many non-corrupt societies or societies that are moving towards lower levels of corruption. They've been much more successful in combating illicit trade.
Great. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll open the floor to questions. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask. Start with that gentleman in the back. When the microphone comes to you, can you please just give your name and affiliation, please?
My name is Niall Swidani, no affiliation really, a Chatham House member. You described something like deforestation as quite an established network of illicit activity, and you also described the dark net, so selling drugs, which is more like a kind of Deliveroo for drugs, a kind of democratization of, illicit activity. Which one of these trends do you think is more interesting, a kind of refinement of existing criminal networks, or opening these kind of criminal activities up to a much wider customer base?
Well, I wouldn't say that you're not opening up these markets to a wider customer base. In each case, you're starting with a relatively small network of people who are involved in this. So in another exhibition at the Victoria and Albert that was on plywood, and that exhibition showed how some of this rainforests that were being deforested, whether they're in Malaysia or Indonesia, where there are a relatively small number of individuals in power who have the authority to cut down these trees, and then they go through supply chains, sometimes through free trade zones. So the network that's at the source is not that large. But if you're looking at the plywood that is made out of this, you're reaching a large number of consumers. The same thing is going on in the dark net. In most of the cases, the people who are setting up these networks, whether it's Silk Road 1, whether it's Silk Road 2, whether it's Avalanche that got much larger, you're looking at not a large number of people that are involved in setting up and controlling the system, yet you're reaching, like in Silk Road, $1.8 billion in sales in 2 years. So you're having a large customer base, but being controlled by a relatively small network.
Any other questions? This woman over there.
Well, I'm just speaking anecdotally because my daughter works on deforestation, and she works in DC, basically in Brazil. And for years I've been following what she's done. And I know it's very sophisticated. They have very sophisticated modeling, and they can find out specifically where the deforestation is being done. And also, they're working with these big companies. For instance, 10 years ago, I think it was, when she exposed McDonald's for what they were doing. And then it went bigger and bigger into all these other companies. So I think the large companies are taking responsibility because now they're feeling obliged to. So from that point of view, I think people are doing quite a lot. But I can understand what you're saying on the lower levels, the very illicit it is.
I think that corporate pressure on citizen pressure on the corporate world is leading to much greater efforts to control supply chains. And a lot of that is much more responsibility in corporations that are dealing with tangible goods, such as you're talking about of McDonald's. There's much more problem going on in some of in cyberspace, where these newer corporations are not showing this kind of responsibility on what they're selling on their platforms.
Let's start with the woman there, and then we'll get next.
Hello, Philippa Marsh. I'm just a member of Chatham. I wonder what kind of role blockchain could have in being able to secure the supply chains, or at least offer some transparency that perhaps other payment forms can't.
It's one of the things that I discuss in my book is the possibility of blockchain doing this. But you have to have a willingness to control your supply chains. And that's important, that people have a desire to implement it, that they have a desire to be responsible. But I think there's a lot of possibility in technology, which is why in this slide that I have up here, it says technology for good. And that's one of the things that I think about.
I think about it a lot as well, and I do wonder about basically the willingness or the appetite or whatnot of oversight organisations or even nation states to have a way to be able to out not just individuals, but organizations. So, for instance, it's easy to out an organization via social media, and, you know, that kind of social, you know, that sort of citizen disruption is super powerful, especially when, you know, you're looking at corporate reputation management and stuff like that. But, you know, is there any kind of organization, is there any kind of structure that allows the outing of these people and organizations and states where there can then be accountability, proper accountability?
I mean, there's not enough. I mean, one of the areas that has been at the forefront of this is organizations working to go against social media that has been involved in facilitating human trafficking. And what?
Sorry.
For example, the Attorney General's report of the state of California, for example, was very, very strong in going after some of the social media that was advertising and facilitating sexual advertisements. I know some of the similar things are going on in investigations in the UK. But these investigations that have been done by Parliament or in the US by Congress that have pointed to the problems of online social media and websites of advertising this have led to crackdowns, have led to disciplinary actions, criminal actions against very powerful members of social media. They've been fined millions, they've been criminally sanctioned at the present time. So this has come a lot from citizen pressure in the US and in the UK as well. So that's sort of the most successful cases that I've seen. But there's not a lot in other areas.
So there's essentially nothing, there's no structure.
There's no structure. And much of the structure that exists is so wildlife groups are working on protecting wildlife and going after social platforms that are advertising wildlife or writing reports to publicize problems of free trade zones and how they're facilitating this. But most of it is on sort of a theme-by-theme basis. So there's advocacy for human trafficking. There's advocacy for wildlife. There are constituencies that are working on problems of the drug trade, but not as a general problem of how all of this is undermining sustainability of life and of the planet. And that's a problem, because it's only when you have diverse groups that come together to focus on change that you begin to have coalitions that can force more systemic change.
This gentleman in the gray jumper had a question.
Peter Hurst, member. I was interested in, at the moment, one of the things is this sort of, what's it called, cohort of people going towards the southern US border. And, when does a commodity, a business become illegal? I mean, if they're not breaking any laws until they try and get into the US illegally, then it's difficult to stop them. I was just wondering your comments about that whole picture.
So one of the problems that has existed for quite a while has been the problem of human smuggling, particularly from Central America north. The incredible violence that exists in Central America. You have, as I've written in this book, homicide rates in Central America that are higher than countries that are in total war. You've got water mafias operating because there's not enough water to drink. So in this extremely difficult environment, people are paying smugglers to move them to safety. And it's a very precarious journey. because the smugglers are not philanthropists. The individuals, they're taking large amounts of money. Individuals whose families can't pay are sometimes just left to die. It's a very, very tragic situation. And at some level, I believe there have to be some coordination. I was discussing this with a colleague of Central American and Mexican criminality, of who's behind this and who's helping on the logistics. But it is part of the problem of how, when you have massive conflicts, where you have situations that become unsustainable for life, you have this, what I would call these problems of migration that are going on, whether it's from Central America, whether it's from West Africa, where you have terrorism, you've got overfishing, you've got lack of water that are making life unsustainable for people there. And as we have these great imbalances between the more developed countries and the developing world, where populations are larger and resources are limited, we're going to see more of this. And as I wrote in this book a decade ago, I wrote that human trafficking would be a defining issue of the 21st century. I didn't expect it to occur and realize that unfortunate prophecy this early in the century.
This man in the t-shirt there.
Hi there, Max Scan. I'm also a Chatham House member. You mentioned the social media and the recent law that's been passed in California with regards to their marketplace with sort of sexual products or something.
No, that's with the U.S. Congress.
U.S. Congress, sorry. Would you say that the social media companies haven't cracked down on this before because they're being lazy, or because they're just not being enforced or not being made to do it? Or do you think it's just because they're finding it incredibly tough?
For example, one of the things that I writing about in the book is how Facebook has been deeply involved in selling arms. It's become a marketplace for selling arms out of Libya. And 70 types of weapons were available through Facebook. Part of this problem is that to address what's going on in your social media takes time. It takes human resources. It requires people to write algorithms. It requires them to follow their data. And this reduces profit and reduces growth. And so there's not been much of an incentive to do this. And so it's not just a carelessness. There are things. There's another company that I've been talking to about trying to do data analysis with them, because they're involved in helping facilitate another type of illicit activity. And yet they're not very interested in doing this kind of data mining, even though it's extremely problematic what they're helping perpetuate. So it's part of a culture of growth without social accountability. So while we regulate in democratic societies, utilities, consumer products, everything about our human welfare, we're not doing this much, particularly in the US, but Europe a little bit more, of these new tools that have become actually so essential for delivery of drugs, I've done a project with my center of monitoring sales of antiquities. A lot of that is going through social media. And when you look at some of this social media, you find that it's even linked to supporters of Saddam Hussein and others. I mean, really problematic elements, but none of this has been removed from social media, because this would take a lot of work, a lot of expense, and this has not been part of it. There's a sense that this is a new online world that should be outside of regulation. And yet, all of this has speeded up the financing of illicit activity, the financing of terrorism, the transfer of money to transnational crime, all of this through this activity. We had DARPA, the organization that helped develop the internet, spent the last few years with a lot of the top computer scientists in the United States trying to understand what was going on in human trafficking, not on the dark web, but primarily on the web and the deep web through these social media advertisements. And they discovered that in 2 years there was $250 million of advertising for human trafficking, $250 million. When you think that most of these ads that are going on social media cost $5 or $10 a piece, it gives you an idea of how fast this is scaling and the level of growth that is going on. And so two of the top platforms for some of this online sexual advertising received 2 years ago, before their website was shut down, $10 million in annual bonuses because they'd managed to scale this advertising so much.
So we have just enough time for 2 more questions. I see 2 more hands, so that works well. I think we'll take them in a batch. First the lady here and then the gentleman there.
Sue Tear from the Ministry of Defence. We recently had some headlines in the British press that we weren't going to have avocados, we were going to run out, because some of the supermarkets said they weren't going to buy avocados from Mexico because it was funding the drug cartels there. To me, my initial reaction was about the farmers, the avocado farmers, and how they would suffer. Do you think some companies might, sort of their misplaced ethical credentials might be making things worse rather than trying to help things? Unless you go in properly and try and clear this up properly, you can have no effect whatsoever and put people out of jobs.
Let's describe both of the questions in one batch.
Hello, David Glass, Chatham House member. What do you think of the idea of legalizing some parts of the illicit economy as a way of bringing dark commerce into the light and controlling it, such as legalization of marijuana in parts of the states, such as talk of legalizing cannabis here? Or do you think that that is self-serving fantasy?
So misplaced corporate altruism and legalization of otherwise legal activities.
All right. So one of the problems of the profits being made by the drug traffickers in Colombia or Mexico is that the profits are laundered into real estate, not just buildings as you talk about in London, but they're into farms, into land. And so this is one of the problems that you have. And whether you call this misplaced corporate integrity, but it's a problem of how this money is invested and where do you take the profits that you've made if you're not going to transfer them out of the country. And so one of the concerns that needs to be is, how do you keep agriculture and foster agriculture that is not controlled and leads to sort of displaced markets. For example, in Colombia, they're not laundering their money so much into avocados because that takes too much work. And they've laundered a lot of the money into cattle ranches, which is why they have cheap beef. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about much more, and that we're not, is what happens to this dirty money, where it's invested, and what the consequences of it are. And that's something that we're not thinking about. But it's now, if you're talking about these businesses that are literally making billions of dollars, the money is going somewhere, and it is having many secondary and tertiary effects that we need to think about much more. The problem of legalization is mostly applied to lesser parts of the drug market. And this is not the largest part. The largest part of what is growing these days is in synthetic drugs, many of which are extremely toxic, and I don't think that anyone in the world would legalize them. You're not going to have corporations legalizing counterfeits, which represent about $500 billion a year in the illicit market. You're not going to have people in most countries of the world legalizing sex trafficking, labor trafficking. So much of this activity is not something, or that if we're going to legalize cutting down trees, what is this going to do to, on a massive scale, do to our, environmental sustainability? So my focus in this book is not primarily on certain sectors of the drug market, which, like marijuana, can be legalized, without many consequences, but on many of the other problems that we're not paying enough attention to, which we certainly don't want to legalize, like harmful pesticides, overfishing, and many other things that are making life less sustainable on our resource-challenged planet.
Thank you very much. I think it's 7 o'clock on the dot, so remains for me just to thank Dr. Shelley for a very interesting conversation on the nature of illicit finance, and to remind you that if you'd like to purchase Dark Commerce, it will be available over there, and to give a warm hand for our speaker.